Boldwood presents The Mersey Angels, written by Sheila Riley and read by Julie Maisie. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Part 1. Prologue, May 1915. Jerky Woods sauntered along the dock road towards Great Homer Street, heading for St Martin's Dance Hall near the open-air marketplace. Unlike many Liverpool people who were in the doldrums about the sinking of RMS Lusitania, affectionately known by the people of Liverpool as the Lucy, because so many of her sons were serving on board, Jerky was in the mood for a good time. RMS Lusitania had been sunk by an Imperial German Navy U-boat off the southwest coast of Ireland, killing 1,198 civilians travelling from New York to Liverpool. The headlines in the local newspaper caused outrage, not only in Liverpool but elsewhere in Britain. But there was a strong maritime community in this part of Liverpool who were directly affected when their son or husband had been caught up in the tragedy and killed. What's the use of worrying? He whistled the tune of the popular new song, knowing the words had never been more appropriate. He had no intentions of worrying about anything. Why should he? Nobody had ever worried about him. Unless he counted Lottie Blythe, who was so clingy since her mother died, and no mistake. She didn't give him a minute to himself, always wanting to go for nice long walks. Hands in pockets, he could think of nothing more depressing than wasting valuable alehouse drinking time to walk hand in hand with a soppy, doe-eyed girl who whittered endlessly about mundane things like weddings and how many kids she would like. Her only interest was getting him down the aisle. She'd even started coming to his lodgings to tidy up, telling him he needed a woman about the place. But she was scandalised when he asked her to move in with him. And why she kept insisting on calling him Jerry, he would never know. "Not without a ring on my finger, Jerry," she said. Well, he was having none of that marriage lark. They had been courting for just over a year, on and off, and she was always wanting to know where he was going and who with. What's it got to do with her? Jerky Woods knew if he wed her, he would be responsible for her upkeep, and he didn't like the sound of that. Paying good ale money for her food and board? Not likely. Lottie even had the cheek to hint that he might want to take the King's Shilling and join the khaki glory hunters at the front. No fear of that happening either, he thought. Look what happened to those poor innocent blighters on the Lucy. The war had been raging for 9 months, even though it was supposed to be over by last Christmas. Jerky Woods believed men had been conned into fighting a war for a country they had no interest in, and the thought churned away in his head. He had no beef with the Germans. Furthermore, if he fancied a bit of fisticuffs, he didn't need to join the army or navy to have a fight. He intended to get what he could out of this war, though, by fair means or foul, and had no intention of becoming a name on the town hall list, like those poor buggers on the ship. 20 minutes. That was all it took to sink that fine liner. 20 minutes. You wouldn't credit such a thing was possible on a balmy night like this, he thought, as scarcely a ripple of a breeze was strong enough to cause the chip paper, he had just discarded, to stir from its resting place in the gutter. He was restless, on the lookout for a nice bit of skirt who wanted a good time and no ties. Even in these prim and proper times, being so close to the docks, a man could still find a good time girl for a quick canoodle in the moonlight. He would tell the unsuspecting female he was serving on board a warship, or awaiting orders to set off for Flanders battlefields, and the girls went weak in his arms. Easy peasy after that. Walking with a rolling gait, so familiar in this North Liverpool area of seamen, Jerky meandered past the market stalls that were closing for the night. He was more than ready to wet his lips with a pint or two. It was a good thing he had his eyes to business when he'd spied Lottie's rent money behind the clock on her mantelpiece. He could not stomach another night of her yapping, and the money was quickly dispatched to his pocket. A sudden outcry from the side street caught his attention, and before he managed to get to the dance, he could hear the heart-rending wail of women whose husbands had gone down with the Lucy. It were a crying shame what the Hun did to that ship. He contradicted his earlier belief that the enemy had done nothing wrong to him or his community, and his footsteps slowed. She weren't even a warship, he thought. She was merchant class. "You come out of there, Kruger, before we drag you out." A rowdy crowd gathered outside the pork butcher shop and shouted up to the window above. Vicious threats were being directed against Germany and anybody with a German name. "It's a bleeding shame it is," Wood said to nobody in particular. "I knew a few good lads on the Lucy," he lied to a black-clad woman crying into her handkerchief, who had just come out of Blackwall Street, where nearly every blind was drawn as a symbol of a death. But when she threw her arms round him and sobbed into his freshly laundered jacket that only came out of pawn this morning, Jerky Wood stood like petrified stone, baffled. He did not know how to comfort the stricken woman. All he hoped was that her snotty tears didn't mark his clean lapel. "My son and me husband both gone," the woman sobbed. "Most of the terraced houses round here were occupied by Irish coal trimmers, firemen, and many of them were sailors who'd been on the Lusitania." Shame that. His words were superfluous, but she wouldn't notice. She was too lost in her grief. Although his blood rose when he noticed a gang congregating on the corner, and already drunk, they were fighting furious. Trouble was so thick in the air he could smell it. "Never you mind, Ma. I'll make sure the Hun pay for what they've done to our boys." It had been a long time since he'd been involved in a good scramble, and as the adrenaline pumped through his veins, he was eager to be part of this one. The dance was forgotten as he picked up his pace, impatient to be part of the action in any disturbance, when he heard the loud crash coming from the pork butcher's shop near Great Howard Street, followed by a deafening shatter of glass and a volley of angry voices. Hurrying up the road, he saw Kruger's butcher shop being ransacked. It didn't seem to matter to the baying crowd that the butcher was not a German immigrant, but Polish, when the front window had been knocked in with bricks and batons, and the pavement was littered with glistening shards of glass. Jerky Wood saw a crowd of men and women demolishing the place, and he decided they needed his assistance when he picked up a discarded house brick and a wooden baton from a broken sash window. Joining in with much fervour, Woods was not satisfied until everything of foreign origin was smashed to smithereens, and as a finale, he threw a lit rag into the devastated shop before stuffing his pockets with pork chops and sausages that had spilled out onto the street. Women were filling their aprons with loins of pork, trotters and pig's tails, obviously not too fastidious in nicking Mr. Kruger's profits before heading home prior to the police vans turning up. But the night was yet young. When the police did arrive, Woods made sure he was nowhere to be seen. Although his luck had run out when he encountered a mob outside the jeweller's shop in Commutation Row, and as he filled his pockets full of sparklers, the bobbies snapped him in their own type of bracelet and bundled him into the back of a police van for an overnight stay in Cheapside before an early appointment with local magistrates the following morning. Chapter 1. May 1916. The first thing Ruby Swift noticed was the clean front door, complete with gleaming brass furnishings polished to a high shine and a spotless doorstep buffed white with a donkey stone. Izzy, on her knees, was scrubbing the doorstep until it was immaculately clean. The ground floor windowsills had already received the same treatment, Ruby noticed, and through the sparkling front parlour window, the The pristine, heavy cotton lace complemented the bright curtains. "You look surprised, Mrs. Swift," Izzy Woods, on her knees, said in a more assured tone than the one she adopted 5 years earlier, when she cowed in the pawn-shop doorway. Mother of Jerky Woods and her younger son, Nipper, Izzy was married to the laziest drunk it had ever been Ruby's misfortune to encounter. And Izzy was no stranger to the pawnshop. She was on her uppers on that cold Christmas Eve back in 1910, when Ruby gave her a 10-shilling note to stave off the hunger and shame of having nothing for her family at Christmas. It changed her life, and she had never forgotten Ruby's kindness. "Not surprised at all," Ruby said, taking in the red, work-worn hands and short, stubby nails that never had time to grow, and was not surprised by the untethered strands of prematurely silver-streaked hair that had escaped its turtle-shell comb. "Not everybody lives in a filthy hovel." There was more than a hint of repressed anger in Izzy's tone when she sank her scrubbing brush into the white enamel pail of hot water, splashing the pavement and almost upending the bucket. Ruby's eyes took in the front lower-story bricks and the pavement outside her front door, which had been scrubbed to remove the sooty coal-fire coating and was drying in the bright spring morning sunshine, knowing that nothing she said would soothe Izzy's worries, especially when the Hun sent those destructive airships. The terrifying Zeppelin raids over Liverpool at the end of January had brought the war closer to home. Ruby knew that these routines of propriety were not associated with class or place. They were almost exclusively the marker of a respectable position, which had not been attributed to Izzy Woods 5 years earlier, when her good-for-nothing husband stole the remainder of the money Ruby had donated and spent every penny on himself and his cronies in the dockside alehouses. "Here, Freddie, wipe your nose," Izzy said, taking a clean handkerchief from her rolled-up sleeve, offering it to a neighbour's child who was lolling against the bay-fronted bricks supporting the parlour window. "Have you had your breakfast yet?" The child shook his head, and, getting up from the step with the agility of a 5-year-old, Izzy disappeared through the vestibule door and up the long, thin lobby. Moments later, she returned with a hunk of freshly baked bread slathered with fruity homemade jam. "Poor little sod. If he doesn't watch himself, Lord Kitchener will persuade him to rush headlong overseas too. Or Lord Derby might introduce him to a voluntary recruitment for infants." Izzy sounded angry, and who could blame her? "I heard about Nipper joining up and wondered if there was anything I could do to help." Ruby knew Izzy's boy Nipper had signed up to fight only after he left her stables, telling Archie, Ruby's husband, he must do his bit. "He isn't even old enough to get served in an alehouse," Izzy said, her anxiety obvious in her galvanised delivery. "Yet they let him go to war." "Poor Nipper," Ruby said to Izzy, watching the child scurry down the street devouring the morning feast. Ruby knew Izzy's kind-hearted nature was only allowed to come to the fore after her late, indolent husband had toddled off his mortal coil after falling drunk into the River Mersey. "I heard Jerky will be out soon," Ruby said, knowing Izzy's oldest lad had caused her nothing but heartache. "Aye, well, that's Jerky for you. I can't see prison changing him." Izzy sighed, kneeling on an old newspaper to save her poor knees from the hard concrete. Leaning back on her heels, she wrung out the floorcloth into the bucket of water. "Always up to something. Takes after his father, he does." Her shame at the antics of her oldest lad was overshadowed by the pride she had in her youngest son. Young Nipper was serving his country while Jerky was incarcerated in Walton Jail for ransacking the pork butcher's shop and attacking Mr. Solomon's jewellery shop in Commutation Row. The authorities prolonged the sentence. He should have got out last December, but he got another 5 months on top for fighting, and it serves him right. Ruby agreed, although she did not voice her belief that Wood should have got far longer to serve behind bars. When your Archie gave me the job in the pawn shop after Jerky was locked up, I was ever so grateful. The job gave me peace of mind. Which you deserve, said Ruby, knowing Izzy was a hard-working woman who tried to keep her head above water. My purse is safe from his sticky fingers for now. Izzy threw her head back and laughed. Obviously, she had more to care about than her clean step, crisp lace curtains, and the most spotless laundry in the street. Yet, Ruby surmised, keeping busy kept Izzy's mind from the worry of Nipper doing his bit for king and country, even though he was not old enough to fight overseas. Any news from Nipper? Ruby liked the young lad, who was as different from his father and older brother as it was possible to be. She and Archie had not been surprised when Izzy's youngest lad came to Ashland Hall and told Archie he would not be working with him in the stables anymore because he had joined the end of the line, took the King's Shilling and was off to fight for his country. Izzy looked thoughtful. "You've got to have one son to be proud of, ma'am," he said to me the day before I waved him off at Lime Street Station. Izzy swallowed hard, and it was obvious she still had not come to terms with the thought of possibly losing him forever. Like every other mother, I was proud to say my boy was doing his bit, but he wasn't the one who should have gone. "You must be worried sick, Izzy," Ruby said, when the mood took a sombre tone, knowing there was a young lad who wanted to do his bit, as the posters pasted on every wall and hoarding pushed home the message that Britain needed brave young men to fight for their country. "Working in the pawn shop takes my mind off things for a while," Izzy said. "The security of a regular wage coming in is still a novelty, and it helps to share a laugh or a tear with other mothers whose sons are away fighting and going through the same thing." "I'm sure you were right." Ruby knew what it was like to be a mother who had no control over the well-being of her offspring. "I admire your resilience, Izzy." "Thanks to you for giving me a chance when I most needed it," Izzy said, getting up off her knees and picking up her bucket, beckoning Ruby to follow her inside with a sideways nod of her head. "My luck changed for the better that time you gave me a 10-bob note." "I don't know what you mean," Ruby said, knowing exactly what Izzy meant, recalling the time 5 years ago when she saw Izzy destitute outside the pawn shop waiting for it to open. "I managed to pay my rent that Christmas Eve," Izzy replied. "So his Nibs didn't get all of it," she said, referring to her lazy husband. "And you could have knocked me over with a feather when the man from the corporation told me I had this new house." The 3-up, 3-down terraced house was further back from the confined spaces of disease and vermin-ridden courts and had its own parlour, a privy in the yard, and modern gas lighting. "It's a credit to you," Ruby said, looking round, admiring the clean, cosy kitchen. "Well, everybody knows you've got to be as close as God's sister to get an house round here," Izzy said, watching Ruby closely. "It was like stepping into a palace after me old place in the court cellar." She was quiet for a moment, searching for any signs of acknowledgement from Ruby, but there were none. "You should play poker, Mrs. Swift," Izzy said, and her face broke into a smile as she placed the black-bottomed kettle onto the hob. "I know you had a hand in getting me this house." "Be off with you," Ruby scoffed, flicking her hand as if swatting a fly. "When I moved in here with Nipper, the family reputation went before us, and the neighbours, no matter how poor they were, would not give me the time of day." "You deserve the chance of a better life, you and Nipper," Ruby said, knowing Jerky and his father were the shrapnel Izzy had been forced to endure for years. Although, when my husband, Splinter, they called him that because of the surname, when he drowned in the dock, all the neighbours rallied round. Good as gold they were, Izzy said. Splinter was well soused when they fished him out, which didn't surprise me. I didn't see him, of course, but I was told you could smell him a mile off. "I'm sorry for your loss," Ruby said, and Izzy shrugged her thin shoulders. Sitting at the kitchen table, that was covered in a blue checked cotton tablecloth, Ruby was not shocked when Izzy said, "Losing Splinter was the best thing that ever happened to me. That and Jerky being locked up gave me the peace of mind I didn't know I needed." Izzy was silent for a moment, and Ruby suspected the thought had only just occurred to her, especially when she added, "I was like a caged bird, set free." She handed Ruby a cup of tea in a matching cup and saucer, and Ruby knew this was something that would have been unheard of in days gone by. "Nothing could hold me back. And when your Archie offered me the job in the pawn shop, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven." "I'm glad the tide turned for you," Ruby said, trying to fathom what kind of terrible life Izzy must have endured, to accept the death of her husband, the detention of her son, and see a job in the pawn shop as a gift from the gods. "You have a lovely home." Ruby did not know what else to say, and pounced on the first thing to enter her head, as she took in the old but well-kept furniture, the polished wood, the pristine linoleum covered in bright, clean rag rugs, the well-banked fire, and the lingering smell of fresh-baked bread. "They can take away all your money," one wise old Mary Ellen told me at Splinter's funeral. Izzy leaned back in her chair, telling Ruby. Her wispy white hair was covered in the black mantilla she kept specially for the occasion, and she said, Izzy lowered her voice in mock seriousness, "You might not have 2 farthings to rub together, missus, but you can hold your head up. You've a spotless home." Izzy threw her head back and laughed again, something she did often these days, Ruby noted. "How's that for getting your priorities right?" Izzy gave a determined nod of her head. "It doesn't matter that I didn't have a pot to piss in, excuse my language, and my husband got so drunk he landed himself in Bramley-Moor Dock, but as long as I had a nice clean house, I was respectable." Ruby laughed too. Izzy's impeccable standards of homemaking were obvious everywhere she looked. Even the cheap pottery dogs on either side of the fireplace were gleaming, and had not seen the inside of Archie's pawn shop since she started working there. Respectability was the heavy burden some women relished, but Ruby pooh-poohed the idea, finding the notion suffocating and intolerable, therefore ignoring it completely. At her father's behest all those years ago, she had left his house and made him a promise which Izzy would probably find scandalous. Ruby vowed to the great man, the master shipbuilder Silas Ashland, that she would shame him in any way she could after what he had done. Ruby then struck out to live, work, and love in her own way. She vowed not to marry until her father was dead, knowing if she had married Archie before he died, she would be disowned, only marrying her beloved Archie to make them legally one after her father's death. She knew the shame of an illegitimate birth, and her living in sin with Archie for all those years would have been the biggest ignominy to be heaped on her father's shoulders, and that was why he had kept the secret hidden within the family for all those years. "So what can I do for you today, Mrs. Swift?" Izzy said from the other side of the table. "2 things, Ruby said, placing her cup on the saucer. "What would you say to a live-in position, rent-free?" Izzy felt her spirits plummet, knowing Ruby's home at Ashland Hall was a country estate set in hundreds of acres opposite the golden northwest shores overlooking the Mersey estuary. Nipper, at 16, and the apple of her eye, had gone off with his head held high and shoulders back to shoot the Hun. When he came home a hero, she knew he would want to come back to the dockside. "A live-in position?" She considered the request, then said, "I could not hold my son, so I gave him wings and let him fly. But when he's ready to come back, his home is here on the dockside with me." Everybody round here knew Ruby had inherited the grand house after her father drowned when the Titanic sank on its maiden voyage. Most were surprised she had come from such a grand family, but not Izzy. She knew Ruby had something about her that was much more refined than many people she had met. Rent-free? Ruby's tone was full of persuasion, and she waited. Izzy loved living round the dockside. She knew these people. They were her people. But how could she possibly refuse such a wonderful position without causing offence, especially after everything Ruby Swift had done for her in the past? You're asking me to move to Ashland Hall? Not live at Ashland Hall, Ruby answered, and Izzy did her best not to look too relieved. I need someone to live over the shop, so to speak. Over the shop, Mrs. Swift? Izzy looked puzzled. I don't understand. It's like this, Ruby said, outlining her thoughts with the tip of her finger on the tablecloth. Archie and I have moved to Ashland Hall on a permanent basis, as you know, but we don't want to give up the pawn shop or the Emporium completely. I'm not surprised, Izzy said. You love the Emporium. Not that I ever went in there much, but I would cheer myself up by looking in the window. The Emporium weren't for the likes of me, not having two halfpennies to rub together. You would be surprised, Izzy, Ruby replied. Some of my best customers didn't have any money to begin with either. Well, you live and learn, Izzy said. But what's all this got to do with me? Archie and I feel we must do our bit for our brave boys like Nipper, so we met up with the Red Cross Society at the town hall and decided the Emporium would be better served as a charity shop to aid the war effort. Father's vessels have been commissioned as hospital ships for the duration, and as Archie has volunteered for the police force, he cannot spare the time to run the pawn shop, Ruby answered. Blimey? Izzy's eyes widened. You lot don't do things by half, do you, Mrs. Swift? Ruby smiled. She liked Izzy's forthright manner and her inability to hide her true feelings. What you saw was what you got with Izzy. Lottie will run the charity shop with volunteers from the Red Cross, while Archie and I were hoping you would manage the pawn shop. Me? A manageress? Oh, I never thought I'd see the day. The relief caused Izzy to let out a little squeal of delight. I would like that very much, and I'm thrilled you trust me. I won't let you down. I know that, Ruby said. Then she smiled and said in a mock-threatening voice, I know where you live. Izzy threw her head back, laughing. The day just kept getting better. You said two things. As a living caretaker, I will pay you, obviously. You want me to move into your fine home? Izzy could not believe her ears. Rent-free, Ruby hastened to add, but there is one condition. Lottie will be moving in too. She has been like an arm without a body since her mother died last year, and I know she has a soft spot for you. For jerky, more like. Izzy knew Ruby would not entertain the idea of her son living over the Emporium, and nor would she. Jerky was the living embodiment of his father and was not to be trusted. If truth be told, she felt sorry for poor Lottie, who was as gullible as she herself had once been. Poor cow. He'd sell her the liver buildings and she would gladly pay. She paused for a moment, obviously working something out, before she said, It's best she lives with me, come to think of it. I can keep my eye on her, and there is less chance of her becoming prone to Jerky's persuasion. Both women knew exactly what Izzy meant, and, as women of the world, neither felt embarrassed by the implication. So, Mrs. Swift, your offer suits me right down to the ground. A responsible job and a respectable address. Izzy could think of nothing better. Except, possibly, that her eldest lad may do something she could be proud of when he was released from prison. Will I lose my home if my circumstances change? Izzy asked, suspecting her tenure over the pawn shop would end when her job did, and was silenced when Ruby put up her hand. You have no need to worry on that score, she said. You can stay in the flat for the rest of your days. There is no time limit. Oh, Mrs. Swift, I don't know what to say. There were tears forming in Izzy's eyes. It's not right what some of them round here say." "What do they say, Izzy?" Not that she was worried, but Ruby liked to know where she stood in the parish. She saw Izzy's cheeks grow pink and realised she was not as old at close quarters as she initially reckoned. "I don't listen to a word of it." Izzy knew she'd made a mistake voicing her thoughts and wondered how she was going to put it right without offending Mrs. Swift. "It's not right, they say you're a hard woman." "But they are right, Izzy. I am a hard woman." Ruby smiled. "I do as I would be done by, and I take no prisoners, especially with those who cross me." Ruby stood up to leave. "Life taught me to be strong in my beliefs, and I believe you were one of the most honest women round here. Otherwise, I would not have given you the time of day." Izzy studied the other woman for some moments. Then she too smiled. "I like it when I know where I stand," Izzy said. Then she tilted her head to one side. "I think we're the opposite ends of the same stick, you and me." Chapter 2. "What's the war got to do with us?" Jerky Woods was outraged when he was given a white feather by a passing suffragist. He'd had his sentence extended to the end of May due to fighting. "I didn't think you'd come," he said to Lottie, as the gates of Walton Prison slammed behind him and gave a two-fingered salute when he saw the posters of Lord Kitchener telling Britain's men that their country needed them. "Let's get away from here," he said, walking in the opposite direction of the recruiting office. The Military Service Act, introduced in January, meant he would be required for subscription. All single men aged between 18 and 41 were obliged to be called up, but he had no intentions of fighting. Not after the year he'd just had. Having been incarcerated in Walton Jail for incitement to violence during the Lusitania riots 12 months ago, Woods had no intentions of joining up. If he could avoid it, he would, especially when he saw the headlines on a local billboard outside the newsagent's shop about the mounting casualties. "Brave men, one and all," said the headlines. Well, brave they might be, but he wasn't stupid enough to get called up. Married men were not being conscripted. "I'm so glad you're out of that awful place, Jerry." Lottie did not believe her Jerry would do the wicked things he'd been accused of. "I can't understand why Ruby won't allow you to live with me and your mother over the charity shop. There's plenty of room." "So, the Emporium is now the charity shop," Jerky said. "I see Lady Ruby didn't waste much time getting out of the dockside." "I've been put in charge," said Lottie proudly. "We send little comforts out to the troops fighting at the front, cigarettes and sweets, that kind of thing." But Jerky was not impressed. "Why should I risk my neck when the beak could do something so heartless as to side with a Hun pork butcher and a German jeweller against one of his own countrymen? It's a diabolical liberty. That's what it was." Hot-headed Jerky was incensed at the idea, and Lottie could see he was building himself into a tizzy. She would have to try and calm him down, worried he might be tempted to smash some more windows. "The authorities said the jeweller wasn't a German. He was Polish." Nevertheless, she felt the power of his wrath in the glare he gave her, trying to ignore an old neighbour who called from across the cobbled road. "They finally let him out then." Lottie straightened her back and put her nose in the air, trying to disregard the old wives of Queen Street, tut-tutting, and saying in a voice loud enough for both of them to hear that her mother would turn in her grave if she knew who her daughter had taken up with. "Why does she want to trouble herself with the likes of him?" Lottie heard the neighbour ask her companion. "She's got that special place in the charity shop." "He'll drag her down, just you wait and see," said another woman. And although the comments were like needles in her flesh, Lottie chose to appear to pay no heed. She would show all of them how wrong they were about her dear Jerry. He had a good heart, and they didn't see the man she saw. They were prejudiced. "What do they know, Jerry?" she said, as dismissively as she could manage. "Do you have to call me that?" he asked. "I've answered to Jerky all my life." "I think Jerry suits you better," Lottie said, with her head held high, linking her arm through his and passing the old Mary Ellens, dressed in their black shawls, singing loudly and proudly as more soldiers marched off to war. Lottie watched for a moment. She would have sung too, but not while she was with Jerry. "I don't see the point in going to war," he said, as they ambled along the pavement, dodging young boys with sticks of wood, pretending they were machine guns. "Why should I fight for a country that won't even give me a job?" "If you keep out of trouble long enough," said a woman who was watching the long line of soldiers marching towards Lime Street Station, "then you would soon get a job." Lottie regarded the well-meaning advice from women she had known all her life as an intrusion into her privacy. "You didn't have to meet me," he said, as they neared the Tram Tavern, and his throat was dry for the want of a pint. "I would have found my own way if you gave me the address of the lodgings." "I want you to see the place," Lottie said, sure that Jerky would change and look after her when they were wed. "So, where are these lodgings you managed to find, then?" Woods asked, inhaling deeply as they ambled over the bridge to the sound of men's voices coming from the pub below, and the enticing smell of beery hops sailed up through the air and into his nostrils. "Just round this corner. It's on the first floor." Lottie's voice rose with excitement. "I've given it a good clean and bought new curtains and a bedspread to brighten it up, and I've got a pan of oxtail soup on the go." She was sure that in the privacy of the lodgings he would be much more agreeable, and the scowl he had worn since he had come out of the prison gates would disappear. Jerky Woods hardly noticed the nice little touches Lottie had brought to the room she had found him in the lodging house not far from the docks. Noisily sucking the gelatinous marrow from the core of an oxtail, his sly eyes took in Lottie's voluptuous curves, and, now that his belly was full, he was aware of another desire, a pleasurable vibration that warmed his blood. But he knew he would have to change his attitude if he was to get what he wanted. The beer could wait. For now. "I don't care less what anybody thinks," he said, knowing he had a willing supporter in Lottie. "I've got what I want right here." She might be a bit gullible, he thought, but she made an excellent soup, and she wasn't such a bad port in a storm. He stretched, showing off the muscles that his daily exercise had honed, aware of Lottie's appreciative gaze. "It would be nice to have a bit of a lie down after such a delicious meal. Maybe you'd like to keep me company," he said, "and show me some of that loving you spoke so much about in your letters." "Jerry?" Lottie's eyes widened in surprise. "It is the middle of the afternoon." "What does the time have to do with anything?" Woods asked. "We don't need no clock to tell us when we can be loving, do we?" "No, Jerry, of course not," Lottie replied. She had missed him so much, but did not quite trust her loving feelings at that moment, knowing they could lead to somewhere very troubling. The only sound in the room was the clock ticking on the mantelpiece, and Lottie felt the need to fill the heavy silence. "I was thinking of getting a job as a munitionette," she said, as she washed the soup bowls at the sink in the corner of the one-roomed flat. Ruby would never have allowed Jerry to live above the charity shop with her and his mother, Izzy. Nor would she be able to succumb to loving feelings if Izzy were hovering in the vicinity. Jerry was bad for business, Ruby had said, when Lottie asked if he would be allowed to stay in the flat. "The factory pay is much better than working in the charity shop," Lottie added. "We could be married in no time." She promised her mother she would keep herself pure until her wedding day. Nevertheless, watching Jerry rise from the table and head towards the bed, she did not feel strong enough to resist this particular temptation. It had been so long since he held her in his arms, since he had kissed her and told her she meant the world to him. Maybe just lying next to him. Maybe just... "I'm not allowing any wife of mine to work in munitions, Lottie. It's far too dangerous." His voice was soft and inviting as he patted the mattress on the narrow iron bed, and Lottie could feel her temperature rise as a low quiver, like a light fingertip, traced her spine beneath her high-necked blouse. "Your wife, Jerry?" she said breathlessly. How could she possibly refuse him when he wanted her to be his wife? Jerky Woods grinned as Lottie, looking coy, lowered herself beside him on the narrow bed. He never was very keen on that marriage lark, but a man has needs. Lottie would never succumb without the promise of a ring at least. Although national conscription introduced in January had called for single, not married men to fight, if he had been as clever as he thought he was, Woods would have realised that conscription for married men had followed shortly afterwards. Chapter 3. "Do you think any of these lot have actually seen action?" Anna asked Ellie, her best friend and fellow nurse, as they sat together at the lavish fundraising dinner hosted by Archie and Ruby, knowing the money raised would go towards enabling the Red Cross to equip Ashland Hall, which, it was hoped, would become an auxiliary hospital for injured soldiers returning from overseas. "I doubt some of them have seen their feet in years, never mind action," said Ellie through unmoving lips, smiling and nodding to the upper echelon of society. People who did not need much encouragement to open their wallets to attend Aunt Ruby's popular fundraising dinner parties, the likes of which Ashland Hall and its staff had not seen in many a long year. Anna laughed, her eyes skimming the length of the 15-foot banqueting table that hosted some of the top masterminds, and her thoughts turned, as always, to Ned, her darling. Engineer first class, Ned was a serving Chief Petty Officer in the Royal Navy, and had shared so much of her formative 22 years. He too had come a long way since he was rescued by Ruby and Archie, when his widowed father, a gypsy fist fighter, was killed. Ned was the one man she loved with every beat of her heart. He and Anna had been friends from the moment they set eyes on each other back in Queen Street along Vauxhall Road, before her home was burned down that Christmas Eve 6 years ago, when she lost her mother and her 3 brothers. The 2 youngest died in the fire, and Sam was shipped off to Canada by the church. Anna had been taken in by Ruby and Archie and had worked in the Emporium. Ned worked for them too, and both Anna and Ned regarded Ruby and Archie as their family. Ruby gave a knowing smile. She had a good idea that both girls were not enjoying another sumptuous banquet after a full day's work at the Seaforth Military Hospital, which was full to bursting with injured soldiers who had been brought back from the front. Nevertheless, Ruby knew such functions were necessary to boost funds, and hopefully to enable them to open Ashland Hall as a fine voluntary nursing establishment. Being the best it could possibly be was the least she could do to help her brave boys to recover. All she had to do was persuade Archie that it was a good idea to turn their home into an auxiliary hospital, but she was a mistress of persuasion where her beloved husband was concerned. He would see things her way, she was sure. Looking round the banqueting table, where honoured, paying guests were enjoying the best food and drink that money could buy, Ruby knew the Reverend Giles Harrington, her abhorrent brother-in-law and mentor of her long-lasting heartache, would have given his eye teeth to entertain some of this lot. And although Ruby had invited her despised in-law and her mild-mannered sister, May, to Ashland Hall many times, the answer was always the same resounding refusal. Maybe Archie had been right after all, Ruby thought. Maybe she had invited the vicar so she could rub his nose in her rightful inheritance of Ashland Hall, which the God-fearing cleric had planned to take for his own after she had disgraced her father. Ruby now realised May would have had no say in any matters concerning Ashland Hall if Giles Harrington had got his grubby paws on their former home after their father was killed. However, the reading of her father's will proved she, formerly known as Lady Rowena Ashland, was the rightful owner of Ashland Hall and almost everything else her father owned. Ruby suppressed a secret smile, knowing she had never even heard of some of the unholy words that came out of the Reverend's mouth before he scuttled off back to Scarborough 4 years ago. Until her father died, Giles had not known where his sister-in-law Rowena was living, or that, as Ruby Swift, she had run a successful business close by on the Liverpool dockside for 20 years. Dabbing the corners of her mouth with a fine lawn napkin, Ruby allowed a satisfied smile. Revenge, she thought, truly was a tasty dish when served cold. She would have been far happier if Harrington had not ordered her sister May to go back to Scarborough with him. However, May was his wife, and as such he would expect her to do his bidding. She had been bequeathed the hunting lodge, and Ruby knew her sister would have loved to put her own stamp on the self-sufficient 5-bedroomed lodge nestled in the vast grounds of Ashland Hall. But the toady Reverend would not hear of her staying on here without him. Ruby was aware May's desires had obviously counted for nothing as far as Giles Harrington was concerned, and she was glad he was not here, brown-nosing some of the most powerful businessmen in the Northwest, some of whom she had discreetly given a financial helping hand in days when their bank balance needed it most, and were now returning the favour. "Thank you, Hargreaves," Ruby said as her plate was removed. She had reinstated her father's trusted staff, whom Giles Harrington had dismissed without so much as a thank you when he thought May, or rather he, would inherit Ashland Hall. The loyal staff had served the family well over the years, so when Ruby took her rightful place in the great mansion, she was determined to bring them back where they belonged. Those, that is, who had not already volunteered to fight for king and country. These were the people she trusted, and who trusted her. The old guard, as her darling Archie called them, knew how to treat important people who enjoyed the cachet of banqueting at the same table as King Edward VII, who had week-ended a couple of times a year in days gone by. Ruby intended to uphold Ashland Hall's quality reputation as an auxiliary hospital and made sure the dinners were a money-raising success. "This house was legendary in its day," Ruby said, regaling her guests, who loved to hear the royal stories they could then pass on. Ashland played host to royalty during the annual Waterloo Cup. The Waterloo Cup, as everybody knew, was a 3-day event held in February, when Great Altcar hosted the most important event in the hare coursing year. "My father plied his guests with 10-course dinners," she told the gathered generals, officers, and high-rolling contributors to the cause. "The banquets were good for business in those days, so my father told me," Ellie informed Anna. "His Majesty came to Ashland Hall when he attended the Grand National Steeplechase at Aintree, just a few miles up the road. Everybody who was anybody wanted an invitation." "Nothing has changed there," Anna answered. "The formal dinners obviously taught Ruby a valuable lesson she would never forget." "No wonder this lot have no compunction about parting with their money when they have royalty to compete with," Ellie whispered to Anna, pleased she had stayed on at Ashland Hall when her parents, May and Giles, went back to Scarborough. "To say they dined at the same table as His Majesty is obviously enough to have them reaching for their wallets." "Ruby opening her previous account books, more like." Anna gave a conspiratorial smile as, having no appetite, she moved her food round her plate. She is determined to do all she can to help her brave boys. She knows these successful men would dare not refuse after her helping hand earlier on in their own careers. Anna's mind was temporarily taken off her worry of Ned, serving on board ship in the middle of who knows where. If, truth be told, Anna wanted to do more than just attend fundraising dinners. The only question was, what could she do? "You seem distracted," Ellie said, seeing her friend's food hardly touched. "Are you feeling out of sorts?" Ned had been gone 20 months, and his letters were becoming more sporadic. The last one she received from him had been read so many times the paper was beginning to grow thin round the edges. She had not heard anything from him for weeks, which made not seeing him even more unbearably raw. However, she was not going to burden Ellie with her worries about her beloved childhood sweetheart, who grew to be so much more. "I think I'm tired after the large intake of wounded servicemen which came in today," Anna answered. "Yes, we hardly stopped to draw breath, and we also had a talk from a member of the Royal Army Medical Corps who told us they carried out their first successful blood transfusion at the beginning of the year, using blood that had been stored and cooled. They're introducing it to military hospitals," Ellie told Anna, who knew this medical